Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
I'm the Reverend Dr. Jamie Mathias, pastor of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. The Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul is such a fascinating celebration. It's a shame that we only celebrate it on Sunday only once every several years. The last time we celebrated it on a Sunday was in 2008, and the next time we'll celebrate it on a Sunday will be in 2025. It's also a shame that most preachers on this day will focus on Jesus' question to his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Preachers will speak of Peter's purported claim that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God, and then they'll ask you, "Who do you say that Jesus is?" This year, though, let's turn the tables on Peter and Paul, and instead of asking who Jesus is, let's ask who Saints Peter and Paul are, and what it is that we might learn from them nearly 2,000 years later. So, who were Saints Peter and Paul, those two great pillars of the church, and how did we come to celebrate them together? Let's begin with St. Paul, and let's be honest. If it weren't for St. Paul, we likely wouldn't be hearing about Jesus of Nazareth today. It was Paul who traveled throughout Asia and Europe, trying to convince the Jewish people that their Messiah had come in the form of a crucified criminal in Galilee and Judea. It was Paul who told the Jewish people that they no longer needed to follow the 613 precepts of the Jewish law, and that they would be saved instead by their faith. And it was Paul who was trying to convince people that they should overlook their differences and live as one body, as one people, as one church. And for his efforts, motivational speaker and writer Og Mandino labeled St. Paul the greatest salesman in the world. But what do we really know about St. Paul? Actually, there are only two sources of information: Paul's own letters and the Acts of the Apostles, a book written by St. Luke, whom it seems was one of St. Paul's friends and fellow companions. Who do you say that Paul is? It likely depends on whom you're reading. In his book, the Acts of the Apostles, Luke lifted St. Paul to the same height and status as St. Peter, such that we now celebrate these two pillars of the early church on the same day. In the Acts of the Apostles, Luke spilled half his ink on the amazing stories he told of St. Paul, of Paul having a spectacular conversion, of Paul baptizing many people, of Paul working miracles, and of Paul's miraculous escape from jail, a tale that largely mirrors Peter's amazing escape from jail in today's first reading. In his own letters, though, Paul doesn't speak of a spectacular conversion event in which he fell to the ground on the road to Damascus. In his own letters, Paul only speaks of baptizing 2 people during his 18-month stay in Corinth. And in his own letters, Paul doesn't mention any miraculous escapes from jail, an event which, if it really happened, would surely have been something that Paul wouldn't have stopped talking about. So Luke definitely paints a high picture of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. And Paul, on the other hand, provides a much more human view of himself. A view that might best be summarized in today's second reading. How it is that Paul poured out his life preaching to the Gentiles, and how it was that despite the sufferings he endured, he continued to trust that God would deliver him from further harm. That was St. Paul. Do we have a warmer image of St. Peter? The only sources we have on St. Peter are the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. Who do you say that Peter is? It likely depends on whom you're reading. Paul was the first to write about Peter, and his image of Peter is far from warm. Paul tells us that he opposed Peter to his face, and that Peter stood condemned because he didn't act in line with the truth of the gospel. Paul suggests that Peter was a stubborn, conservative man who refused to abandon the Jewish law and who was wrong on a number of issues. Mark was the next to write about Peter, and we remember that John Mark was a fellow companion of Paul as well. He tells us that Peter rebuked Jesus, and that Jesus referred to Peter as Satan, and as a guy more interested in human concerns than in the things of God. Peter's last words in the Gospel of Mark are words of denial, and then Peter disappears from the scene. Though Matthew shared similar stories of Peter rebuking Jesus and of Jesus rebuking Peter and calling him a stumbling block, Matthew was the first to present Peter in a slightly more favorable light, with Jesus saying in today's gospel that Peter was the rock on which Jesus would build his church, and to whom Jesus would give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Luke was the first to redeem Peter's image in the Acts of the Apostles. Luke shared stories of how Peter, now filled with the Holy Spirit, powerfully preached to the people, baptized thousands, performed miraculous healings, and in today's first reading was led forth from prison by God's angel. And finally, John painted a picture of Peter as a warrior, ready to draw his sword in order to defend his friend Jesus. And it was John who effected reconciliation between the risen Christ and Peter, with John's story of Peter 3 times professing his love for Jesus and being entrusted with the Lord's flock. Wow! The very high pictures of Peter that we have in Luke and John are very different from the very human images of Peter by the likes of Paul and Mark. Did you ever notice that? How different people paint others in different ways? Some more positively and some less positively? So, as we celebrate Peter and Paul, these two men who have been painted so differently by different people, we might do well to stop and consider how we're painting others. The words of others about Peter and Paul have endured for centuries, affecting the way that people have seen these two. And our words have lasting impressions too. With your words, are you presenting others in a good light? Are you speaking kindly of them, to them, and behind their backs? Or are you using your words to destroy others, to paint less than favorable pictures of them, presenting them in a less than favorable light? Your words have lasting impressions. But if we're going to ask what we say of others, it's only fair that we ask what others say of us as well. As we celebrate the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, we might also do well to ask ourselves what others say of us. Do they paint us as pillars within our families, within our neighborhood, within our community, and within our church? And if not, why not? Jesus' question to his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" is an intriguing, thought-provoking question. As we celebrate the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, may we reflect on what it is that we're saying about others and what it is that they're saying about us. They color our legacy, and we color theirs.